Really delighted to be here. My name is Jordan Camp, and I'm a part of this crew that helped organize this. It's really exciting to see you all here. Welcome. It's an honor for me, and I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our morning keynote, Professor Mary Helen Washington. Mary Helen is Distinguished University Professor in the English Department at the University of Maryland College Park, specializing in 20th and 21st century African American literature. She earned her PhD from the University of Detroit, where she subsequently directed the Center for Black Studies. During her time there, she supported the activities of the Dodge Revolutionary Union movement, associated with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, engaged with activists like General Baker, Kenny Cockrell, Gloria House, and others, helped with the production of plays by figures like Amiri Baraka. She then moved to take a teaching post at the University of Massachusetts, and from there to University of Maryland, where she's taught for the last 28 years. We decided this morning. Her monograph, The Other Blacklist, The African American Literary and Cultural Left, published by Columbia University Press, received honorable mention in the William Sanders Scarborough Prize competition from the Modern Language Association. When I've taught the book in my seminars, it became an important touchstone for students in offering a bold challenge to Cold War anti-communism and insisting that American studies, as Christina emphasized, take the Black radicalism, feminism, anti-imperialism, and internationalism of the Harlem left seriously. It insists that we put the Black left feminism of people like Alice Childress, Claudia Jones, Lorraine Hansberry, and others, and the socialist internationalism of W.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Eslanda Robeson, and others at the center of our work in the field. It also insists on engaging with their work as a point of departure for understanding the roots of our own predicament. She's edited 3 collections of African American literature, Memory of Kin, Stories About Family by Black Writers, which was published by Random House, Black-Eyed Susans and Midnight Birds, Stories by and about Black Women by Doubleday. And she also edited Invented Lives, Narratives of Black Women, 1860 to 1960. She has served as the president of the American Studies Association and was awarded the ASA's Carl Bodie Norman Holmes Pearson Prize for Lifetime Achievement in 2015. Her current project is Afterlives, Legacies of the Black Literary Left. I hope you will join me in offering a warm People's Forum welcome to Professor Mary Helen Washington.
Well, thank you all for coming out today. Thanks to all the people from Barnard who organized this event and who invited me here. And thank you to all the people that are responsible for opening and creating this beautiful space. I am a little concerned that I did not get named by the far-right group. It's like, maybe at the end of this talk, they'll be more aware of me and put me on the list. This paper represents the first step in this new project that I'm calling Afterlives of the Literary Left. So you are the first to hear this, actually the second to hear it, and to help me figure out the next step. You know, The Other Blacklist was an easy book to write because so many of the people on the left were still alive and could be interviewed, and I talked to people like Esther Cooper Jackson and Lloyd Brown and Alice Childress and Gwendolyn Brooks, and I talked to people who knew some of the people in the book. I actually talked to Elizabeth Catlett, and now when I try to work on the afterlives, which starts for me in the 1960s, you know, I feel as though I'm not on the same kind of firm ground that I was then. In any case, this talk begins and was motivated by a song that was written by Bernice Johnson Reagan. And it's a haunting and challenging and beautiful hymn about the invisible networks of capitalistic exploitation all over the colonized world that exploit people, but that we are so unaware of. And it ends with a woman from the United States going into a Sears department store. So I'm gonna just play a little bit of this. It's called Are My Hands Clean?
It's touched by hands from all over the world. 35% cotton, 65% polyester. The journey begins in Central America in the cotton fields of El Salvador. In a province soaked in blood, pesticide-sprayed workers toil in a broiling sun, pulling cotton for $2 a day. Then we move on up to another rung, Cargill. A top 40 trading conglomerate takes the cotton through the Panama Canal, up the eastern seaboard, coming to the US of A for the first time, in South Carolina, at the Burlington Mills. Joins a shipment of polyester filament courtesy of the New Jersey petrochemical mills of DuPont. DuPont strands of filament begins in the South American country of Venezuela, where oil riggers bring up oil from the earth for $6 a day. Then Exxon, largest oil company in the world, upgrades the product in the country of Trinidad and Tobago, then back into the Caribbean and Atlantic seas to the factories of DuPont, on the way to the Burlington Mills in South Carolina, to meet the cotton from the blood-soaked fields of El Salvador. In South Carolina, Burlington factories hum with the business of weaving oil and cotton into miles of fabric for Sears, who takes his bounty back into the Caribbean Sea, headed for Haiti this time. May she be one day soon free.
Okay, so it ends with third world women doing piecework to Sears specifications, and the central figure of the song going into the Sears department store to buy her blouse on sale for 20% discount, unaware, of course, of all these other networks. And then the song asks, are my hands clean? So what I'm going to do today is to try to connect Bernice Johnson Reagan's hymn to a novel called Daughters and a writer, Paul Marshall. I don't know how many of you know Paul Marshall. I'm going to put up her picture, and the talk is called Paul Marshall and Global Black Left Feminism. Okay, so I can do this. It's an early picture of Paul. I really wanted to start here with her books on the screen. In early May 1965, 3 months after the death of her good friend Malcolm X, the writer Paul Marshall received an official letter inviting her to accompany the once red-baited and blacklisted Langston Hughes at his request for a month-long cultural tour of Europe sponsored by the United States Information Service. These cultural tours were, in fact, clearly political. For the U.S., they were a strategy for exporting an image of the United States as a colorblind democracy. For the Europeans, they were at least partially designed to shore up U.S. financial aid, as well as their image as anti-communist. As we learned from her 2009 memoir, Triangular Road, and I may not have all, yes, it's up there in the corner. This is her memoir, Triangular Road. Marshall was panicked when she was summoned to the State Department. She had actually grown through the 1950s, so she knew what that might mean. She was summoned there for a briefing before being approved for the tour. She was interviewed there by an official who pointedly placed her hand on the extensive dossier on her desk, which Marshall says she knew was filled with her denunciations and actions against the government. And she says, I discovered they had the papers on me, the incriminating evidence, inside a sizable accordion-style folder or dossier, my dossier. From the size of the thing, it had to contain a detailed account of my involvement in every political organization to which I had ever belonged, from the Communist Party fringe American Youth for Democracy to the Association of Artists for Freedom. Despite Marshall's extensive file and the woman's white-gloved warning, seems you've been fairly active, Marshall writes that she fully intended to be, quote, openly critical of U.S. policies, even if her freedom to criticize might be used as a sign of the triumph of American democracy. As Marshall remembers the tour in Triangular Road, Langston Hughes maintained a strange silence, while she and the other young black writer on the tour, William Melvin Kelly, eagerly denounced the deep and lingering racist nature of American society. Detailing with urgency, she remembers, especially in the student-dominated Q&As, the racial violence against young civil rights workers in the South and the government policies that sustained and perpetuated the problem. Some of these are her words. According to the now unclassified State Department report, Marshall's hosts in Copenhagen were so dismayed by this unfavorable image of American democracy, they wrote back to the State Department in their evaluation that the two writers had left the image of the United States bloody and tattered. This is a picture of the tour which a colleague of mine found. Marshall is there, Langston Hughes is there, and William Melvin Kelly is there. They're in an abbey right outside of Paris. This is the entire cultural tour that took a picture. And this is the State Department airgram that I found at the University of Arkansas that describes what happened on this tour, the bloody and tattered image of the United States. Although it says this was to the immense delight of the students in the audience. And the report concludes that they were greatly relieved that such a, quote, mopping up operation like that of Hughes and Marshall is rare. What might get lost in the retelling is that the Q&As were largely conducted by the progressive-minded young graduate students and scholars who repeatedly asked about the U.S. civil rights movement, and they sparked Marshall's outspoken critiques. However explosive this encounter in Copenhagen sounds as I retell it, Marshall's narration of these events in Triangular Road is so brief and breezy that it was only when I found the mopping up reference of the tour in these archives, later reprinted in the Pittsburgh Courier, that I realized that Marshall and Hughes had ignited a small diplomatic firestorm. Triangular Road is the document that comes the closest to acknowledging Marshall's left past, though even as she releases the evidence of that past, she soft pedals her affiliations with the left with a dismissive nod to her subversive dossier and communist fringe organizations. My goal in this talk today is twofold. First, I want to use this the State Department incident and Marshall's 1991 novel, Daughters, to insert Marshall into what Michelle Stevens calls the literary genealogy of Black transnational discourse. By any measure, Marshall belongs in this genealogy. From her first novel, Brown Girl Brownstones, in 1959, to her short stories in Soul Clap Hands and Sing, 1960, The Chosen Place, The Timeless People, 1961, Praise Song for the Widow, 1984, Daughters, 1991, and her last novel, The Fisher King, in 2003. And I'm listing all of these because Paul Marshall is really so unknown. You know, in some ways, Toni Morrison took up all the space in the 1980s, and a left-leaning author like Paul Marshall often was obscured. All of her fiction plays out across oceans. So all of her fictions take place across oceans, mainly between the U.S. and the Caribbean, and features migrations across a long, imaginative saga of African diasporic communities. Marshall herself, a U.S.-born, second-generation Barbadian, has spent more than 60 years traveling back and forth and writing about the U.S., Haiti, Brazil, and most of the West Indies. Like the central figures in her fiction, she has always been about disrupting the gendered constructions inherent in transnational Black narratives by men. I want to suggest that while the politics of Black nationalism are abundantly clear in Daughters, as in Marshall's own life, these radical left politics and, it turns out, a queer subtext are largely submerged in most of Marshall's work. But they are so fully in play in Daughters. That's why I was so drawn to this novel, because these more politically left, radical political inclinations in Marshall, it's very, very hard to ferret them out in her other novels, but I see them much more fully in play here. Marshall was identified with the left in a number of ways in the 50s and 60s. At Brooklyn College, she was a member of the college branch of the American Youth for Democracy, formerly the Young Communist League, which she dismissed as the brief rebellion of a 17-year-old. But as I look back over and try to reconstruct this political history, I find her first short story was published in a 1953 leftist publication, Contemporary Reader, which identified her correctly as a member of the left-wing Committee for the Negro in the Arts. In the 1950s, she worked as a writer and reporter for Our World, published by a leftist, John P. Davis, who was blacklisted in the 1950s. And Marshall has never disclosed what's in her subversive dossier, that is her FBI file, but we see that it almost got her barred from the cultural tour with Hughes. One historian, Shirley Perry, has interviewed Lorraine Hansberry's personal physician, who's since deceased, Bert DeLugoff, one of the owners of the Village Gate in Greenwich Village and the best man at Lorraine Hansberry's wedding, who said that Marshall and Hansberry frequently visited the club together during the time Hansberry was being followed by the FBI. As you can see, my work in the 1950s is still operating here because I'm looking all over for where was she, who was she running around with. So if she now seems cautious about these left affiliations, she was certainly open about the left circles that she ran around with in the 1950s, and was then in the early 1960s completely outspoken about being part of Black nationalist organizations. So she freely talks about being in the Association of Artists for Freedom. And then at a 1964 symposium, you can really hear this kind of political radicalism coming out. She speaks at this symposium called The Black Revolution and the White Backlash, where she explicitly uses the rhetoric of Black nationalism, calling for independent Black organizations and the rise, quote, through revolutionary struggle of the darker peoples of the world and the decline and eclipse of America and the West. So it's almost like she got her full radical voice in the 1960s with Black nationalism, and we kind of see the left being, the traces of the left growing dimmer. Then in the 1960s, and what I see as the third stage in her political activism, Marshall began writing for the left-wing feminist international journal, Freedom Ways. It was edited by Esther Cooper Jackson, a radical feminist and communist, who intended for it to center women in the Black radical agenda, bringing together veterans of the communist left, Angela Davis, Sarah Wright, Esther Jackson, Alice Childress, and Lorraine Hansberry, with the younger militant women, Alice Walker, June Jordan, Toni Cade Bambara, and Paul Marshall. So what I intend to do today is to try to synthesize this political pastiche in order to show how Marshall was using that political resume to create a distinctively transnational feminist, and I will maintain a potentially queer political narrative in Daughters. One of the other things that I'm trying to do here is to follow something that my colleague Gershon Aviles claims about Black nationalism. He says that that he calls his approach to black nationalism, he calls it disrupting inhabiting. And by that he means that aesthetic radicalism, that these aesthetic texts can acknowledge the value of political frameworks, but they also recognize fragmentation within those collectives. Thus, aesthetic radicalism, and this is what I'm claiming about Daughters, is that it operates out of this kind of tradition of aesthetic radicalism that can become a lens of disruption that attempts to unhinge the components of ideology that threaten to constrain expressions of identity. So I contend that in Daughters, the sign of her black political radicalism is the disruption of sanctuary, the refusal of the securities of home, nation, and heterosexuality, and always an insistence on asking and answering this question, are my hands clean? So now I want to turn to Daughters to show how answering this question leads Marshall to imagine a possible, if provisional, blueprint for this black, what I'm calling her black, left, queer, feminist transnationalism. Now I know that's a lot to unload on this one novel, but it's a big novel. Not only is it big, but it is unwieldy, and it really is almost impossible to synthesize. I would love for people to read it and help me go back and figure out what I've left out. But let me make an attempt at a synopsis. The novel is situated between two countries, 8 major characters, and at least 2 centuries. It's situated between New York and New Jersey in the United States, and then a fictional Caribbean country called Tri-Union, which Marshall says that she intended to be a composite of Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and the way that that world would represent the 3 major colonial powers of the Caribbean, England, Spain, and France. So you see, she was very intentionally transnational in this novel. The main daughter of the novel is Ursa Mackenzie, born in the United States in the 1960s to an African-American mother, Estelle, and Primus Mackenzie, the man who will become prime minister of this fictional country of Tri-Union. The entire novel is narrated through women's perspectives. 3 American women, Ursa and her mother, Estelle, her friend Viney, whose name is short for Vince Soretta, her closest friend. Those 3 voices intersect with 3 Caribbean women, Celestine, the servant who raises Primus, a woman named Astro who rises from poverty via her creamy skin and straight hair to become the prime minister's mistress and manager of his estate, and Malvern, Astro's shantytown friend and confidant. The interplay of these 6 voices in the text, speaking to one another across borders of class, sexuality, and nation, forms the collective that Marshall intends as a feminist intervention in empire. The novel is situated around the moment of post-colonial independence in Tri-Union, when Primus Mackenzie, Ursa's father, is up for election and being challenged by 3 forces: the Conservative Party, the Fortune 500 companies of US and Canada, and by a young revolutionary politician named Justin Beaufils, a name that means stepson, which I will attend to later, and his unnamed Cuban-trained agronomist wife. So you could see in this little figure of Justin Beaufils something about what Marshall is saying about the future, and Primus Mackenzie representing a past. In Midland, New Jersey, where a new black mayor has been elected, Ursa is working with a friend in a non-profit grassroots organization. So historically, Daughters is set in the 1980s. It's published in 1991, which means that Marshall is writing this in the mid to late 1980s. And so we think about the 1980s, you think about the election of Ronald Reagan, the 1990 U.S. invasion of Grenada and the defeat of the radical insurgency of Maurice Bishop and the New Jewel movement, and all the concerted efforts to destabilize progressive governments in the Caribbean. You can see that Marshall knows that history, and this is the fictional component of that history. For Marshall, it was also the end of her second, and by her account, non-conventional marriage to a Haitian businessman with what she says were political ambitions. So she may have had a personal reference for the prime minister in the novel. All right, so I'm going to try to give you a little sense of the arc of the novel and the strategies that she's using in this novel to get at her political critique. The novel proceeds by a means of a series of doubled frames, juxtaposing scenes of first world privilege and third world poverty and powerlessness, thus revealing what the novel calls a sense of double exposure. Ursa begins to feel as though everything is superimposed on everything else. And that is first observed in two contrasting abortions. Ursa's abortion takes place in an elegant midtown Manhattan clinic designed, Marshall writes, in soft focus with pale, long-stemmed lilies against a background of mauve and dusky pink. With all the latest equipment and a multicultural staff that treats Ursa with professionalism and compassion. The Latina receptionist is smiling as she hands Ursa a decorator's shopping bag of cosmetics and capsules. After Ursa is well enough to walk the 40 blocks home, to go out to hear Betty Carter or Carmen McRae at the Village Vanguard, and even clean her apartment. In every respect, this non-traumatic, safe, legal, insurance-covered abortion on the Upper West Side of Manhattan represents Ursa's elite status. But it also forecasts how Marshall intends to use that status to enact a series of disruption. In the contrasting scene in Tri-Union, Astra Ford seeks an abortion after a vicious rape by a sailor from the British ship the locals call the Woody Wilson, docked in Tri-Union's port. Contending with men knowingly watching her, she is told to go around to the side door. The scene is narrated entirely in her interior voice, talking to her like she had come to beg him for a few cents to buy a penny bread. His hot and sweaty eyes, taking every last stitch she had on off her, down to her small clothes, the rubber sheet, brown with stains, the doctor with mysterious eyes as though he might be blind, and no anesthetic. All the women waiting, ignoramuses like myself. She leaves with a bottle of something wrapped in brown paper, in so much pain she can hardly walk. It's like the idiot went and left the wire thing inside me. And then as Malvern cautions her, she stops to throw down a handful of dirt so the child won't come back to hag her spirit. Ursa's abortion, which also causes her to separate from her lover, motivates her to disassemble her life of privilege. Again, a recurring theme in Marshall's work of black women recognizing and rejecting their lives of middle-class privilege. She resigns her corporate job. She cancels her health club membership, gives up her apartment in Park West Village, sells her corporate suits, her furniture and car, and takes a job with a nonprofit in the mostly black and poor Midland city just across the Hudson, where she will be working with her old friend and grassroots organizer, May Ryland, with plans to assist the black candidate, Sandy Lawson, in his campaign to become the city's first black mayor. I want you to watch this transition then she makes, because in the very act of discarding these privileges blacks secured through the civil rights movement, Marshall is making a critique that threads through all of her fiction. as Ursa washes out the relaxer in her hair to wear it in a thick, long afro braid. We see that this change represents her resistance to corporate America setting the standards for Black inclusion in the national body. And I want you to remember that this rejection of Black inclusion in the national body, despite the fact that these were the very privileges the civil rights movement was supposed to grant. Ursa's abortion and her disrobing enable a kind of second sight as she begins to identify her own place in what Erica Edwards calls the new map of racial terror. She sees the changes around her in the new Lincoln Center, noticing that the faces that flow by are Black, white, Latina, Asian, but mostly white. The young and the restless upwardly mobiles, as she calls them, who have taken over the lower half of Columbus Avenue and flow through the cafes and the boutiques in their designer jeans to their high-rise condos, gentrifying the entire city. To paraphrase Erica Edwards, Marshall is using this post-race Black novel to imagine the violence in these discourses of prosperity and upward mobility that power the new racial spatial logics of the world after the end of legal Jim Crow. The double set the second set of double exposures sets the small industrial city of Midland against the capital of Tri-Union, showing the way the deteriorating material conditions for the poor in both environments are shaped by global corporate power and the neoliberal regimes that manipulate the new Black politicians recruited to preside over a declining urban industrial base, or the new Black entrepreneurs pursuing their dreams of, quote, selling the race. By the time Ursa arrives in Midland City to work with the grassroots organizer May, the new Black mayor, Sandy Lawson, is already estranged from May and presiding over the new expressway that cuts through the ward of poor and working class people. And these are the words that May uses to describe that expressway. She says he is going to run a road through us like we ain't even here. And one of the things you see all the way through is that Marshall is so attentive to the way the body is impacted by these changes. And with Sandy Lawson, the new Black mayor, she explicitly presents a scene, a silent scene, in which we see Lawson framed by the powers that control him. In his office, he is framed between the two flags of state and country. Again, his whole body is caught between those two flags. And then as he leaves his office, he is framed between two white men in dark suits, obviously men of power, who appear with him at the top of the newly constructed rectangular all-glass building that houses the mayor's office. And again, you see how Marshall is attentive to these structures that are being built and to the meaning behind those structures. At the top of the wide steps of this newly constructed building, the men are talking to Lawson at once as they walk in close formation down the steps. Lawson's head turns from one to the other like someone at a tennis match, and all three begin to laugh. Then at the bottom of the steps, Lawson follows one man into a limousine, the other climbs in beside him, and they disappear behind the car's dark tinted windows. So we see Lawson now shown through the complete control of his body. The powers are now in control of his voice, his feelings, and his body. But she doesn't end with Lawson. She ends the chapter with the voice of May Ryland, the grassroots organizer. And this is, again, where this kind of left critique comes in. She raises her voice to reassure Ursa that she is not defeated. And she says, I'm like the Viet Cong, just laying low in the jungle. And then in a replay of this scene of U.S. neo-colonial power, Ursa and her mother Estelle maneuver the defeat of the Prime Minister, Primus Mackenzie. an event that specifically recalls the 1980s U.S. invasion of Grenada and the defeat of Maurice Bishop and the New Jewel movement. So we see Primus then agreeing to a program that the Fortune 500 companies want to do in TriUnion. And that finally triggers the activism of both wife and daughter. Estelle is distraught over Primus's capitulation to capitalism, and she gives a preview of the new TriUnion. She says, instead of the small farmers cooperative, the hospital, the cannery, the factory, there will be the 18-course golf course, the casinos, the tennis courts, the health club, the marina, the filet mignon flown in fresh every day from Miami. Paraphrasing Michelle Stevens, we see the masculine Caribbean Black American subject, Lawson in Midland and Primus in TriUnion, imprisoned in his own home by the forces of empire. Black rebellion is now initiated and carried out by 3 revolutionary women of privilege, May, Estelle, and Ursa, and as the novel suggests, by the unnamed Cuban-trained rebel wife. We begin to see at this point that the unequal position the woman is assigned in each of these scenes is a measure of each man's potential for being co-opted into perpetuating the class, racial, and gender inequalities that together sustain the repressive political and economic systems. So as I'm sure is obvious at this point, I'm insisting on this feminist critique by Marshall, shown through the abortions, the political reversals, the bonds among women, the gestures to revolutionary histories, and we see that as her attempt to foreground the national, international, intellectual, and activist contributions of Black women radicals. As scholars of the left like Dale Gore, Eric McDuffie, and Cheryl Higashida, and others have argued, these contributions have often been obscured by the tendencies to trace the traditions of radical activism through established male figures of prominence. Okay, now I have to segue into the last third of the novel, and the way in which that last third of the novel, if it doesn't undercut what I've said now, it at least becomes a kind of unexpected turn. A change of perspective that I say is almost inexplicable. While the entire narrative up to this point situates all of the women in heterosexuality, relationships between men and women begin to fall apart or are shown as spiritually and physically devastating for all the women. Women are sustained throughout the novel by other women. A queer sexuality is suggested in several scenes, beginning with the night in a public pool when Ursa, a strong and skilled swimmer, rescues her friend Viney from a potential suicide over a bad love affair. That's the first kind of glimpse that you have of the failure of heterosexuality. Viney slips into the depths of the pool, then finally floats up to the top in Ursa's waiting arms, and the two are entwined in the pool. After that, let me get this way. Viney subsequently produces a child by artificial insemination that she names Robeson, after the most famous Black left man in history. Then Viney and Ursa travel as a family to TriUnion with Robeson, where a scene of global encounter registers their queerness, and it's done through the voices of Astral and Malvern. Now, I want you to understand this almost seems pasted onto the novel, but it's a place in which the queerness of that family is registered by these 2 Caribbean women commenting on the 2 American women. And actually, I had a slide with that on it. Oh. See if I can call up wrong way. A little bit of the dialogue from that so you can follow along with me. Okay. I don't know how much of this you can read, But Astral begins. It's funny, she tells Malvern. It will be 4 years this August since she was here last. That's the time she came with this friend of hers I told you about, the one like a long drink of water. And the friend's little boy, a force-ripe little man who has to have his say in everything. Don't you remember me telling you that the three of them came over to Mile Trees and how she and the friend were strolling about the place and lying out on the beach laughing and talking? No, man, I has yet to see her with a man friend. She only came down that last time with this tall something in a pair of sunglasses that took up half her face. For all you know, they might be two good wickers you see them there. The wick of the lamp might be all they care about, the only thing to satisfy them. They might not have any uses for a man. So that's Astral's kind of homophobic suspicions about these two women, although it is suffused with her own erotic desire about these two women. Then as the novel's only proletarian woman and the community's oral voice, Malvern, a woman beaten down by childbirth, marriage, and poverty, and now dying in an overcrowded ward of the government hospital, counters Astral, surprisingly, and says, it's the modern times. Everybody doing as they feel to and saying to hell with whoever don't like it. And who's to say? Maybe those women God made so have the right idea. At least they don't wake up one morning and find themselves saddled with a head of children, draining every ounce of their strength and their life gone. That's one thing you can say for them. As brief as this comment is, and it's never repeated anywhere in the novel, nor do any of the major characters, Ursa and Viney, even hear this, it does show Marshall in pursuit of a kind of radical inclusivity that defines a queer feminism. Acts of bonding that challenge, cut across, or occur outside social norms and structures. Malvern names same-sex intimacy modern. She considers the possibility that Ursa and Viney are, quote, women God made so, and believes that maybe they have the right idea compared to women like her. The recognition of the queer, the final act which ensures disruption in Daughters, is a key to understanding Marshall's radicalism in this novel. One critic contends that lasting black security requires full incorporation within the body politic, for only then does the possibility arise of acquiring unmediated access to civil and human rights. And I believe this is the basis of the civil rights movement. But Marshall is not interested in incorporation within the body politic. Her references to the left, to black power figures like Baraka, to communist activists Herbert Aptheker and Angela Davis, to revolutionaries trained in Cuba, to violent indigenous rebellions, to Viet Cong guerrillas, to Paul Robeson, and to Malvern's speech in support of the liberating possibilities of non-normative sexuality are signals of her disinterest in full incorporation within the body politic. Her role is to disrupt the body politic, to point out its corruptions, to lead her characters to undo their connections with these privileges, including the privileges of heterosexuality. Now, I am almost sure that if I talked to Paul Marshall, she would completely reject this reading. Knowing Paul, she explicitly says in interviews that she wanted to reinvent a history that would represent a spirit of unity among black women and men. I don't know how she wrote this novel. And particularly, she felt that she could express that future through the figure of Robeson, the most famous black left man in U.S. history and the epitome of physical strength and black masculine beauty. In the novel, however, Robeson is befriended by a little girl, Dee Dee, who wears her hair in red, black, and green hair beads, lives in the projects, and is vigilant about protecting Robeson after he's injured in an incident with the police. So let me suggest that little Robeson, raised in the queerly constituted intimacy of this new family constellation, might very well constitute that radically different man Marshall was imagining and endorsing in the process a feminist queer future. There is one last moment of double exposures in Daughters, a scene of intimacy and privacy. And I maintain it, it's always these scenes of intimacy where you really see what Marshall is after. After Primus's defeat, Ursa is lying on her bed, physically and emotionally exhausted. She turns to see her reflection in the mirror and recognizes the high domed forehead of her father, of the forehead that was the predictor of his future glory. So prominent does she see this in the mirror that she recognizes that it obscures the parts of her face that are distinctly hers. Okay, so let me just read that last little section where she says, it overshadowed those parts of her face that took after no one but herself. They were simply Ursa. She'd catch her reflection in the mirror, and all she would see for that moment was his forehead, sitting like the dome of the Sistine Chapel on top of her face. And what's interesting, of course, that also describes Marshall's face. She has that high domed forehead. Her mirror reflection undercuts the assumption that transformations can be easily assumed by discarding one's corporate clothes or even by engineering the defeat of a prime minister or a mayor. The initials PM, after all, stand for Prime Minister, and Primus Mackenzie, and Paul Marshall. Perhaps suggesting that we are all marked by masculinity, that the work of transformation is ongoing, that answering that question, are my hands clean, has to be asked over and over. I am suggesting that this queering of Daughters, then, though, produces that disruptive inhabiting that calls for a critique of all political rhetoric, and again, ask us to ask the question, are my hands clean? So let me end by going back to Marshall's legacy, left legacy. The fact that Black women's empowerment narratives in popular culture, and I'm thinking here of Black Panther, Hidden Figures, The Color Purple, are so often tied to normative femininity and to integration, corporate inclusion, and cosmetic multiculturalism is yet another reason I always turning to narratives of Black left cultural front feminists like Marshall. They constructed a left feminism that provided the original script of Black women challenging U.S. empire and domestic surveillance politics. And I'm thinking here of women like Alice Childress and Hansberry speaking at rallies for the blacklisted, sponsoring parties to benefit progressive unions, working on the campaign to repeal the Smith Act or to restore Paul Robeson's passport, raising money for the South African resistance movement. I mean, that is her legacy. All of these activities designated subversive by the FBI. Marshall's State Department firestorm was just such a moment and may have, in fact, enabled the political energies of Daughters. But while the Black left queer feminist politics of Daughters certainly exceeds the Black left theories of feminism, I still want to insist on Marshall's heritage. In the words of Eric McDuffie, she is deeply indebted to the richly textured feminist conversations that were initiated, debated, and expanded on by her comrades within the communist left and the Black Popular Front. Thank you.
Okay, we got started a few minutes late, but we do have time for one, maybe two questions for Professor Washington. So, and I have the mic, I could walk up to you.
Hi, I loved your talk. Thank you so much for that. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to your idea of double exposure. And when I was listening to that sort of recurring image, to me it seemed like it was queering this idea of genealogy, right, and of passing down ideas and of genealogy as this kind of metaphor for how legacies of thought get passed on. So I'm wondering if, if there's any juice to that, or if you could speak to that a little bit.
Well, I think that the double exposure is a little bit of a comment on double consciousness, which is so much about disempowerment, and the double exposure in this novel becomes a kind of inscription of her power, that she's able to have this second sight where she never looks simply at what's happening in the U.S., but always connects it to what's happening in the Caribbean. She sees what's happening to elite women, and she connects that to women who don't have those kind of privileges. And so I think what she was saying there is, and it's specifically connected to this legacy of civil rights, which was so much about progress and so much about us entering into, the spaces of inclusion in the national body. And that the double exposure becomes a disruption of that inclusion. If you have to look the way Bernice Johnson Reagan's song forces us to look, we can never be satisfied with this progress narrative. And that's what I think she's essentially trying to undercut.
Thank you so much for this. I love Paul Marshall and haven't read Daughters, but was sort of struck as you were describing it by how it seems to share the kind of scale and ambition of Chosen Place, Timeless People. But was curious about how you would, how you think about the sort of arc from that through Praise Song for the Widow to Daughters, because Praise Song is a much more kind of individually scaled, single person's self-realization in an almost sometimes like romantic kind of register in her trip to the Caribbean. And I wonder, especially as you're tracking this novel onto a kind of post-civil rights evolution in her politics, how you're thinking about that kind of longer arc from a kind of big collective scale novel through an individual scale novel back into this large cast of Daughters.
You have said exactly what I would like to say in the answer, that when I look at something like Praise Song, and then I look at Daughters, I think, this is the individually scaled novel. This is the novel with the happy ending. This is a novel where you go to Carriacou and the Caribbean, and you come back transformed, and then you can then become a kind of elite revolutionary. And it feels as though Daughters is undercutting so much of what she was doing all along. That was a much kind of easier answer to how change takes place. But you said it beautifully. It's exactly why I went to Daughters, is because I was dissatisfied with the other novels and with their kind of, to me, easy political transformations, and transformations that took place within the nation, and transformations that took place and still left privilege and elitism untouched. And here I feel like that's why I think this novel is so difficult. I feel like she wants to tear apart that, the kind of easy political solutions of her earlier novels. Although I still love Brown Girl Brownstones more than all the rest of them. And I don't know, I think it's because that was the novel that was the closest to her and her own experience. Yeah.
I hope everyone will join me in thanking Mary Helen Washington once more.